Okay, here. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And again, thank you very much for coming to today's session. I'm actually running a program I'm running has a little bit of a time delay. It's about a 20-second time delay between me speaking and what you see live. So I just want to make sure that you could hear me and see me, um, and I appreciate you coming out. So my name is Darren Woods, and I'm president of 365 Christ-Centered Leadership. Today's focus is going to be, I believe, a hope. I believe in pray and hope, a blessing to you. We're going to be talking about ditch, deal, and delegate. Three principles that I believe every church leader should use in order to, number one, decrease anxiety or stress level, and then number two, to increase productivity. And I want to start by focusing on the mission of 365 Christ Centered Leadership, which is to ignite passion for serving Christ, church, and community. And the order of those three C's, Christ, church, and community, is very purposeful. It is important, both for now and eternally so, to have a proper relationship with Christ as accepting him as your Lord and personal Savior. And in our relationship with Christ is also something that should draw us to a church. And that's a church with a lower C, or low C, I should say, in terms of a local assembly. And we also recognize that Christians from all over the world are part of the big C, the Universal Church of Christ. And not only does that relationship with Christ and your involvement in ministries involving your local church helpful, but it's also helpful in terms of your community. The gospel message in the Great Commission is about going and telling, not keeping things to yourself. So that's at the very heart of what we're about at 365 Christ-Centered Leadership. I want to introduce a phrase that may or may not be familiar to you, and that is church revitalization. And what does that involve? Because this is really at the heart of the session for today. And so we're really talking about, in terms of church revitalization, the process of identifying, assessing, and perhaps even more importantly, addressing those factors that can hinder a church's health, efficiency, and growth. And by growth, we're not only referring to a numeric growth, but we're also referring to a spiritual growth as well. All right. So there will be, I hope, questions that you have as we talk about these three principles involving ditch, deal, and delegate. And here's what I'd like for you to do to make it easier for me. We will entertain questions toward the end of today's session. If you can do me a favor, and that is in the comment section, if you can type the letter Q followed by your question. And that way I can distinguish between general comments, and I appreciate those certainly, from questions that you have. So again, if you can type the letter Q before your question, that would be very, very helpful. So you see an example here, Q, what do you do if someone accidentally sends an email sent for someone else? That will really, really help me in terms of, again, distinguishing between general comments and questions, okay? All right. So for today, we're going to be focusing on a number of different things for our agenda. First of all, the overall session and goals we're going to talk about. We're also going to define the three principles of ditch, deal, and delegate. In addition, we're going to discuss examples from both an everyday occurrence as well as a more a biblical approach to these three principles. And I'm going to spend most of the time sharing and discussing with you a number of different tips and strategies that I have found helpful with regard to these principles. I've been a church administrator for about 17 years formally, but I've been involved in Christian education and church administration in one form or another for over 20 years. So I'm hoping to provide some very valuable, tangible, practical tips and strategies for you. And then, as I said before, we will end with our Q&A session, as well as an invitation for you to come alongside me in a little bit more intimate way with regard to the church consulting Facebook group that is a little bit more refined and focused with regard to what it is that we are doing today. So let's dive in, shall we? All right. So I first want to talk about the principles. What are the three principles of ditch, deal, and delegate? Well, quite frankly, it's no surprise that all of these principles address how we respond to learning about, accepting, or even introducing other individuals to different tasks. Okay, so when we talk about the concept of ditch, it's something that you avoid because the task is unimportant to you or doesn't concern you. In particular, we're focusing our discussion with regard to church leaders in areas of church ministry. So I want to be careful here to lay out what I mean by these concepts of something being unimportant to you or something that doesn't concern you. It is important, the task, whatever it is important to someone in one way, shape, or form. The question is, what do you do and how you respond to that task, whether someone asks you to perform a particular task in a church, or even as you're thinking about asking other individuals. And certainly we're going to unpack these concepts a little later on. The second principle we're going to talk about is that of deal. So whereas ditch refers to avoidance, deal focusing on addressing the particular task because it does require your immediate attention. And thirdly, separate from ditch and separate from deal is the principle of delegate. And so with delegate, you realize and understand the importance of the task being done, but by the same token, you assign that task or ask someone else or other individuals to do that task because it does concern you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be the one to perform the particular task. So again, we're going to be focusing on these three principles of ditch, deal, and delegate. And I thought for today that what I do is focus on some specific examples. And the first example I like to talk about is what I refer to as the mailbox shuffle. The mailbox shuffle. So I'm pretty sure you have encountered this either in terms of snail mail, the traditional mail that goes through the U.S. Postal Service that you find in your mailbox, as well as electronic mail, whether from your job, your personal email account, etc. These examples apply. That's why I refer to it as the mailbox shuffle. So one example of walking to your mailbox or opening your email account is that of ditch. Maybe there's some promotional credit cards. Credit card companies are constantly sending you information to either switch to their credit card in order to have a lower interest rate to pay off the debt from another card, or perhaps you may not have a credit card or a debit card, and so you receive mail asking you to fill out information, etc. That would be something that personally I would ditch because I have one credit card, purposely so, and I'm not interested in any other credit card. So if I get that information in the mail, I'm going to ditch it. I'm going to throw it away. The second principle is that of deal. In this particular case, I happen to pay many of the bills in the family, and so I get that bill from DTE or Consumer Energy or cell phone company, etc. I'm going to deal with it. If I put that aside and don't address it in a very short amount of time, I may flip the switch in the house and there's not going to be electricity. I won't have a signal in my cell phone, so I would need to deal with that. But the third type, or the third principle, involves delegate. And in that delegation, the information is important. However, it's not necessarily important to me, or it is important, but I'm going to pass that to someone else. So, for example, our son Isaiah loves to purchase sports equipment, shoes. He's a student athlete. So in the mail, there would be promotional coupons or temporary holiday sales for local sporting goods departments or sporting goods stores. I'll give that information to him, put on a kitchen table for him to take a look at it. So again, that's just kind of an everyday use of ditch, deal, and delegate that we encounter quite frequently, even without thinking about it in one way, shape, or form. The next example I like to point out is one that is more grounded in terms of scripture, because that's what we're about. The examples of the mailbox or the email are important, but they're a means to an end. And where I want us to focus on is what I'm referring to as Bible talk. So we see an example of ditch in 1 Corinthians, the 15th chapter and the 33rd verse, where Paul, the Apostle Paul, talks about what Christians should ditch. And so I just want to read that verse. Again, it's 1 Corinthians 15th chapter, 33rd verse. Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. And so Paul is talking about fleeing or ditching those things, those tasks, those interactions that don't bring glory to God, that can cause people to stumble, either ourselves or those around us. The second principle is located in Matthew, and this is Matthew, the 14th chapter, verses 13 through 21. And this is the passage where Jesus addresses the physical needs of the crowd and performs a miracle by feeding the 5,000 fish to people. And so that's a situation where Jesus sees a particular need. People are hungry. They've come to hear him preach, and he realizes that it's something that he has to address immediately in terms of their physical hunger as a means to also simultaneously talk about their spiritual hunger as well. The third principle is that of delegate, and this is probably one of my favorite, definitely my top 5 favorite examples of delegation in the Bible. And we find this in Nehemiah, the 6th chapter, verses 1 through 4. And if you haven't had an opportunity lately to read the book of Nehemiah, I strongly suggest you do it, and try to do it in maybe 1 or 2 settings, because in this particular portion of Nehemiah, he is already in the process of leading the rebuilding of the wall in Jerusalem that has been torn down by enemies all around him. And so Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem are actually individuals who are enemies of Nehemiah, and they are trying to distract him from coordinating the building of the wall. And so once one of the foot soldiers, if you will, of Nehemiah informs him that these individuals want to talk to him, he basically tells that individual, go talk to them. I'm busy. I have things to do. And so hopefully you get a better idea in terms of, even in scripture, and these are just 3 very quick examples of the 3 principles of ditch, delegate, and deal. Or I should say it in order: ditch, deal, delegate. Welcome for those who are joining us. I'm glad to have each and every one of you. We're going to be answering questions at the end of the session. And so in the comments, if you have a question or questions, if you can begin that comment with the letter Q, followed by the question, that will help me out quite a bit, because then I can filter through and enjoy not only the comments you have, but specifically address as many of the questions as I possibly can. All right. Thanks so very much. I appreciate it. All right, so let's move on and focus on some of the strategies and tips with regard to these 3 principles of ditch, deal, and delegate. I think this is really the meat and potatoes, if you will. Again, I found these concepts. I certainly didn't develop them or think of them on my own, but the way in which I've been able to apply them as a church administrator has been very invaluable for me. But I can also confess to you that there's some times where, and it shouldn't come as any surprise, we phase in and out of the ditch, deal, or delegate principle, any one of those. We're never always ditch or always deal or always delegate, because that would be a very unhelpful as well as unhealthy place to be. So I don't want to give the impression that we're stuck in any one of those three modes for an extended period of time. We phase in and we phase out of those things. Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit more, shall we? All right. So I want to break this next section down to considering how we as church leaders and individuals involved in ministry should respond after someone points out to us, ask us to do a task or be involved in an activity. I also want to address when we ask others to be involved as well, because I think it's very helpful to understand both sides of the coin, if you will. All right. All right, dear. Let's see. We have some more people join us. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate you. Thanks for stopping by. Appreciate it. So, the questions to ask when learning about a task. All right. Let's say, for instance, you hear a morning announcement, and you find out that there is a call to help with an upcoming event, providing food distribution in your community. All right. So when you hear that clarion call to do the task, or when someone asks you if you would like to be involved, one question to ask is, does it need to be done? Right. The current generation, and actually but the slogan for Nike Corporation is "Just Do It." So sometimes there's a tendency for us to have someone ask us and us answer immediately, but slow down a little bit. Does it need to be done? Does that particular event need to take place? And of course, different people have felt needs, so I don't want to diminish the importance, because someone who's asking you to help them obviously feels it's an important thing to do. But again, we're talking about the concept of determining whether we will ditch, deal, or delegate with the information that's brought before us. And then secondly, does it need to be done now? So assuming that it needs to be done, so if your answer is yes, it needs to be done, does it need to be done now or later, right? So one of the things to think about is, say for instance, there is a water spill in a particular section of your church, and people are walking by and looking at it, and people are like, wow, that's a shame. Someone should really do something about that. That might be something you want to do at that particular moment. People's safety is at hand. If, however, there's a situation where there is a chair that needs to be repaired or replaced, you may not want to take time from morning service repairing that chair. Maybe set that aside and deal with that at a later date. All right. Next, I want you to think about the question, who can do it? So not only does it need to be done now or later, but who can do it? And really, this can has to do with the ability, right? The ability to do something. I absolutely hated it when when I would ask, can I go to the bathroom? And my mom would say, yes, you can. In other words, you have the ability to, but the ability to doesn't necessarily mean or result in the fact that you should do something. So it's about availability, or I'm sorry, it's about about availability and ability in more than one way. The next two are somewhat interchangeable there, but you're really at the heart talking about both availability and ability. The third question, or the fourth question to ask yourself when you hear, again, these are questions when you hear someone ask your availability to do a task, or you find that there's a particular need. Who should do it? All right, does it need to be done? If so, now or later. Who can do it? Who should do it? This has to do with capability. So for instance, let's just say that I see that I see that there is a need to um, replace a microphone, or there's a need to look at a drum set and repair the snare drum. Do I mean do I actually have the capability to know how to do that, or am I going to mess that up? So you want to make sure that you're focusing on, in terms of that question, a capability, and then finally, who will do it? Who will do it? And this is key that I found, because at at uh, at issue here is accountability, right? Not everyone not everyone wants to be accountable for a task that's done. You want to be careful that you don't either oversimplify or actually hyperbolize something that needs to be done, because sometimes it's the impression that, well, you know what, you should just be glad I did it because no one else is going to do it. Take it or leave it. Why are you so concerned about how well I did something? So this has to do with availability. Again, these are 5 questions that I found to be very helpful when learning about a particular task that needs to be done. All right. Next, considerations about, excuse me, considerations when someone asks you about a task. All right. When someone asks you about a task. Now, there is a distinction between the previous one, and that has to do with learning about, finding out. And it could involve you learning because someone asked you, but it's more likely learning because you hear it, you receive the information, etc. This consideration, in terms of someone asking you, is much more the direct. This is, Darren, can you help us with this event going on in 2 weeks? We're hoping to provide and distribute food in our community. Now, if you look at these two possible responses, you may think that the first one is a little bit too harsh. I would disagree, and the reason is I believe that there are two answers that you should give. One is an immediate decline. No, I can't help out with that event in 2 weeks in terms of distributing food in the community because I have parent-teacher conferences on that day. I'm not available, right? The decline immediately falls in that ditch category, but you have to also understand that people have feelings as well. I'm reminded of someone who several years ago said this, and I'll never forget it. And this is in response to someone asking them to help a particular task in their church. And the person said, "No is a complete sentence. No is a complete sentence." Oftentimes, the the instinct we have is to explain why we're not able to. And I understand that. I think that's healthy. By the same token, we also shouldn't be guilt tripped after saying we can't or we're unable to do something by the person asking us, to the point where it's almost like a browbeating, wearing us down and to submission until we say yes, yes, okay, even though we don't want to. So decline immediately. The second suggestion I have in terms of what to do when someone asks you to perform a task is, don't commit immediately. Even if you feel that your answer is going to be yes, even if you feel that, hey, I'm going to be free on that day, etc., don't commit immediately. So, what does that sound like in terms of a response that you may give someone? It may sound like, you know what, let me get back to you. I need to check my calendar. It may sound like, that's a great idea. It seems very interesting, but I'm going to pray about that. And as a word of caution there, please don't use prayer in a sort of flippant, generalized way. Um, But if it sincerely involves you praying in terms of if this is God's will for you to be involved in this particular event or do this particular task, by all means, be straightforward. Perhaps even ask the person who's asking you, will you pray for me because I'm not quite sure, I'm torn, etc. We have and I'm sure Marty won't mind me sharing this. She doesn't have a choice, so I'm going to share it anyway. But I kind of sarcastically say when it comes to committing to different engagements that we may have involving our church or personal professional lives, we love Google, and I have my entire life revolved around Google Calendar. So my ongoing joke is if it's not in Google Calendar, I'm not committed to do it. So, you want to be careful in the way in which you say, let me get back to you. But I would hope that the person asking you would appreciate that. It's better to err on the side of, I'll get back with you. And quite honestly, even if you think the answer might be no, but you're not quite sure, I believe that person will value your honesty and frankness, and hopefully they will respect you. And if it does cause a problem between you and that individual, for you either declining immediately or asking them or telling them, let me get back with you, I think there's some other issues that are more important than that task, and that has to do with some things we're going to talk about really briefly. All right. So the next thing I want to address is the questions to consider when you ask someone about a task. So now the shoe's on the other foot. Again, as I mentioned earlier, these principles of ditch, deal, and delegate are very fluid. Someone else might ditch when they hear about or learn about a task. You may deal with it. Someone else might delegate it. So I'm not suggesting there's a right or wrong avenue in terms of ditch, deal, delegate. My suggestion, or what I'm offering to you, is understanding and applying these principles will alleviate stress and pressure of, or maybe even guilt of telling someone no or yes, if you mean the opposite, but also it maximizes your productivity because we are not superhuman. We can't do everything at all times. We can't run on all cylinders all the time. And so we need time to step back, to take a break from a few things. Okay, so considerations when you ask someone about a task. First question to consider is, and again, these are questions to ask before you even place that clarion call, before that announcement is made, however it is, before you pick up the phone or text or message someone in terms of their availability or willingness to do a task. What is their spiritual giftedness? I'm sorry, what is their spirit? Yes, what is their spiritual giftedness? So there are three types of inventories which are almost unspoken in churches, particularly among church leaders. And I don't know if it's because there's not a connection in terms of these being very amoral, neither good nor bad, or at least two of them are. One of them is a personality survey. And that kind of talks about how we interact, right? I happen to be an introvert. Well, there are other individuals who are extroverts. So having some awareness of our leaders' personality traits might impact whether we ask someone to do something. So as an introvert, it takes me a while to warm up to people. So I may not be the person who you want to speak in a crowd of 5,000, 1,000, whatever number of people. I may have some apprehension there, so that might be a consideration in terms of asking um, um, someone else to do that. The other type of inventory is the learning inventory. There are a number of them out there, but how do we tend to learn? Do we tend to learn based upon reading information? Do we tend to learn based upon hearing information? Do we need to have kinetic? Do we need to touch and feel things, etc.? Now, why am I mentioning those other two surveys? Well, if you understand the importance of those inventories or surveys, and we've all taken them in one way, shape, or form on our job in school, perhaps in some ways officially, in some cases less officially. But the third one gets to the matter. What is the other individual's spiritual giftedness? I'm not quite sure what it is that causes Christians to not want to share with other believers their spiritual giftedness. It is not something that we are proud about. Apostle Paul talks about, why are you proud about that? I'm paraphrasing here, but why are you proud about something which God has given to you? You didn't earn it. So if you are familiar with someone who has a gift of encouragement, that might be an individual you ask to consider to become a greeter. If you know that someone is very short tempered and is kind of off at times, standoffish, if you will, you might not want to consider them or ask them to be a greeter, because that's in many cases the first face that the individuals see when they enter the church. The second question to ask yourself before asking someone else to perform a task is, what is their spiritual temperament? What is their spiritual temperament? And by this, we're really referring to their spiritual maturity, right? So if there is a new convert in your church, someone accepted Christ as their Lord and Savior last week, might not be expedient to then ask them to lead a group Bible study, right? There may be some spiritual maturity that needs to take place. I would hope so, in terms of teaching the Word of God, learning more about it, etc. So keep that in mind as well. Again, be careful about these categories. I would highly recommend you continually pray about them and not just arbitrarily look at individuals and say that person's mature, that person isn't. And this has nothing to do, well, I shouldn't say nothing. Most of the time, it's not connected to age, right? We should not assume that because a person is an older Christian in terms of age, that they're necessarily more spiritually mature than younger age Christians. Certainly life experience and things of that nature are important, but we're dealing with, again, spiritual maturity. If there's someone who loves to gossip and you know they love to gossip, perhaps it might not be expedient for you to ask them to be a part of the group involving discussion of very private matters. Third, what is their previous track record? Their previous track record. My former pastor, who passed away a few years ago, Elder George Williamson, would often say that church leadership, particular pastors, should not appoint or ask people to do a task in order to prove their faithfulness, to prove their commitment. They should be asked to do various tasks based upon their previous track record in different areas. So, for instance, if you know someone, and we all do, I mean, you can all envision people's names and faces. If we know an individual in a church who's consistently, habitually late to service, maybe it may not be a good idea to ask them to do the welcome, but it might be a better idea to ask them to do a benediction or ask them to have some comments toward the end of a particular program or event. Lastly, what is their availability? What is their availability? Now, this is also important because at this particular point, it's balancing and understanding and prayerfully being attuned to having a relationship with individuals that you're asking, because it may be something that they're not able to or unavailable to do. If they're a full-time college student who also has a part-time job, you might want to consider that. Again, this has to do with the availability. Perhaps there's someone who is always volunteering or the first person asked to do a task in a church, and you're thinking, you know what, that person probably is already overwhelmed. It might be better to ask some other individual to be involved in it, or perhaps ask that person to help mentor someone else to alleviate the different hats and stress levels. We're going to be ending shortly. Again, if you have questions in the comments section, if you can do me a huge favor and type the letter Q followed by the question, then I can filter the comments from the question, and we'll be able to answer as many questions as we possibly can before our time is over. All right, so as a review, we talked about the ditch, deal, and delegate principles that I believe every church leader should embrace and use because it helps to decrease stress and anxiety, but also maximize productivity. Before we get into the question and answers, I just want to point out a couple different ways to connect with me on Facebook. One of the ways is to look at my website. It's 365christcenteredleadership.com. 365christcenteredleadership.com. Facebook. Many of you are on Facebook right now, but when the video posts, perhaps you're watching on YouTube or other social media platforms that I have. But the way to connect on Facebook is 365 Christ Centered Leadership. So basically, facebook.com/365 Christ Centered Leadership. And the third way to connect, and this is one I'm going to spend just a couple seconds on, is with our Facebook group. So you're viewing this particular Facebook Live through the general 365 Christ-Centered Leadership timeline, but the 365 Christ-Centered Leadership Church Consulting Group is a group of individuals, much like yourselves and others who are more than happy to join, talk in more detail about topics that are introduced in our other Facebook Lives. So, for instance, next Monday, August the 23rd, from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the 365 Christ-Centered Leadership Church Consulting Group is actually going to delve in even more detail with regard to ditch, deal, and delegate. So if you go to our Facebook page, you click the group tabs, and you can join the group. There are a couple questions I do ask of you to make sure you're not a robot, and also to get some idea of your interest level and your involvement in church, or if you're not involved in church, that's fine as well. And some code of conduct, some community building rules that we have and agreements in terms of how we interact with one another. So again, that's going to be a Facebook Live event in the church consulting group. So I encourage you, if this session or even upcoming sessions are ones that have blessed you or have blessed you and that will hopefully prayerfully in the future bless you, feel free to join the Facebook group, because we're going to again go into a lot more detail on the subject areas and matters that we're covering in somewhat less detail today. And there are going to be some perks as well. So again, next Monday, August the 23rd, from 7 to 8 p.m., the church consulting group will have a session, and we're going to dig in even deeper with regard to ditch, deal, and delegate. So I wanted to let you know about that. Okay, so really quickly, as you're thinking about some questions here, just a quick reminder. If you have a question in the comment section, type Q and then what your question is. I said the comment section, the post section there, and yeah, let's see what's what here. Let's see what questions you have for me. We have about another 15 or 20 minutes left in the session today, and I want to be able to answer as many questions as I possibly can here. So I'm going to connect here in a different screen so I can see what's what. All right, so I think I know this person. So Marnie asks, Marnie happens to be my wife, in case you're wondering. We don't just share the same last name for no reason. So what do you do when there's no one to ask? Great question. What do you do when there's no one to ask? Well, there are a couple things. If you recall, when we talked about things to consider, that kind of falls in line with either the availability, right? So if If no one is available to help initially in your community event plan, etc., it might be a situation where that task isn't done. Now, that doesn't mean it's not done ever, but it could very well mean that it's not done at that particular time. Maybe it's done at a later time. Maybe you regroup and scale down a few things. It may involve you looking outside, and you have to be careful here, but understand and hear where I'm coming from. Outside your local C church, again, a small C, it may involve you connecting with other churches in the area or finding community organizations or church organizations or ministries which are currently doing what you would like to do, and maybe partnering with them so that you won't have the burden of doing everything either yourself because there's no one to ask or people aren't available, or it could also be a situation where people's availability, or I know you said no one to ask. In part, that could be because they're involved with other things that they are dealing with as well or delegating. And so, from their perspective, you asking their involvement is a ditch, no immediate response. But I think you're also talking about bodies, like numbers of individuals, right? And so, again, I would connect in terms of social media, the friends that you have. Hey, how about this as an idea? Uh, Unselfish plug here. Why not bring some of those concerns and questions to the 365 Christ Centered Leadership Church Consulting Group? We can offer some advice. I don't pretend to know everything about everything, but I do know some things about some things there. So yeah. Hey, how you doing, cousin? All right. Good to see you. All right. Lim has a question here. How do you begin to replace those that have been handling certain tasks for years and years? Woo, man. We're not live, are we? We're not recording, are we? Don't tell anyone I said this. No, just kidding. So wow, this is so. Let me start with what I believe to be and what I've used as a foundation that's at the premise of your question, but I'm also going to answer your question. So I'm not tap dancing around. Okay, the the church is the one institution where common sense doesn't always win. What do I mean by that? Historically, in churches, when are the times in which officers or individuals who have a particular task no longer do that task? They're no longer in charge. One of three things leads to a person no longer being responsible for the task in broad categories. First and most important, most unfortunate, I should say, is death. And the reason I say that as death is I'm reminded of the old Charles Heston video that I saw. He was president or chairman of the National Rifle Association, NRA, and basically held up a rifle and basically said, I'm going to continue on this fight until they rip this rifle, this gun from my cold, dead hands, right? So unfortunately, death is something that leads to a vacancy in the position or a task for someone who's done it for a long time. The second reason or impetus for having people involved in a task for years and years is the inability or unwillingness for others to help, right? And thirdly, I would say there's not a leadership pipeline. And by that I mean all of us in whatever ministry we're involved in have not always been involved in that particular ministry, unless after birth, after the doctor, slapped your butt and you said, "Glory, hallelujah," you've been working for Jesus since literally day one of your life. Down to reality. So we have to understand in a church the importance of transitional leadership and also the leadership pipeline, planning ahead, partnering individuals with those who are not necessarily younger exclusively, but those who have an interest, and allowing and being willing to allow people to make mistakes, which we all have done in one way, shape, or form before we have done the things we're doing right now. So, how do you begin replacing those individuals? I would say, in no particular order, praise them, congratulate them, thank them for what they have done. Let them know that their work in terms of the work of the vineyard is not done. Help them realize that the person and the position are not the same. In other words, when someone thinks of you filling a blank task, they think of this one person. We have to be careful that pride doesn't kick in some cases, you may find that people, when you really talk to them one on one, acknowledge that change needs to occur, but they're unequipped or unable to relinquish, for lack of a better word. So it involves prayer and understanding, because certainly we don't want to quash people's areas of ministry. But by the same token, kind of an anecdote to this, only in a church will you find someone adding the word ministry to legitimize what they do. So finally, to your question, Lim, sometimes folks are doing things because they want to run the show. I have a tissue box ministry. I have a parking lot ministry. I have a toilet paper ministry. I have a toothbrush ministry. Just because people are involved in doing things doesn't mean that they should be married to it. Now, certainly your leadership needs to ask very hard questions. In some cases, it may require a pastor having that conversation with the person, saying, you know what, we appreciate you, but we're going to be moving in a different direction. And finally, too, to your question, Lynn, there is this wonderful title called emeritus. And that has to do with honoring trailblazers, honoring people for whatever extended time they've been involved in a particular task, etc., and letting them know that they're still wanted, they're still appreciated. But I truly believe that God does not want us to burn out and die outside of. I mean, obviously God is sovereign, and I don't want to sound morbid, but God is sovereign. By the same token, we need to make sure that we don't overtax and stress people out to the point where they're physically unable to help. But there may be some people who are just plain stubborn, and that's unfortunate. But it is what it is. Yeah, yeah, Kim, death, absolutely. Other questions that you have? Someone asked, is there a way to access your presentation on Facebook? So what I'm going to do is have a PDF of the session available, and it will, well, a PDF of the slide presentation. So I will post that probably tomorrow when I do a little fine tuning, some formatting, some things. So yes, I'll be able to provide this to you, the slide. Let's see here. Any other questions or comments? What about, okay, all right, great. Kim asked, what about, hey, Kim, what about mentorship programs to pass the baton when it comes to an older worker? Absolutely. And so here's the thing. The idea, the concept of a mentor rolls off our lips quite frequently, especially in everyday lives as well as our professions. I happen to be a high school teacher by profession, and several years ago, I was responsible for the teacher mentor program. And actually, I was one of maybe 4 or 5 people many moons ago at the school who basically created the mentorship program at my school, because the state has some very ambiguous guidelines, and so we want to rein some things in. And I have served as a mentor to teachers, and there are teachers who are either new to the profession of teaching or new to our school, etc. And so when we talk about mentorship programs, I think there has to be conversation to drill that down even more, because there needs to be buy-in. So quite frankly, if the pastor or the pastor's board, however your church is constructed, pardon the pun, isn't on board with some type of mentorship, doesn't make explicit what it looks like, then what will often happen is basically people will be asked, certain people will be targeted and asked to do different tasks based upon family, relationship, friendships. It can cause a strain in a church, because what could happen is, under the guise of mentorship, people often want individuals to work with them who will not who won't disagree with them, who are basically there as puppets. And it's a great book. I can't remember the author of the book because it's been on my mind, and that is a book called Leading from the Second Chair. Leading from the Second Chair. And it has everything to do with of different leaders understanding their roles. And I say roles in quotation mark. Maybe calling might be a better phrase there. Some individuals are not called to be leaders or begin or start as a leader in terms of president of, chairman of, CEO of, director of, coordinator of, etc. And so the premise of the book is that there needs to be an individual who assists, who understands their role and calling and is comfortable in it. And the person who with whom they work understands that second in command, if you will, is not a relegation based upon some sort of superiority complex. There are individuals and teams who complement one another, right? I think about the Star Wars Next Generation TV series, and Jean-Luc Picard is the captain, and Will Riker is the second in command. Well, the captain calls his second in command number one. So he'll say, "Number one, I'd like you to do this." And you're thinking, wait a minute, Picard's the captain. Why is he calling his lieutenant number one? Well, his is the captain's number one guy, number one person next in line, in the absence or in the cases of a captain not being able to fulfill duties. And so we need to embrace that. Thank you. I appreciate that, Marnie. The author's name is Michael Bonham. Yeah. Leading from the Second Chair. I think that's one of the top 10 books and one of the best books that I've read. Actually, my aunt Lola Davis suggested that to me, gave me a copy of the book many years ago. I think I returned it to her there, but Leading from the Second Chair is an awesome book. All right. Any other comments or questions before we end tonight's session? Again, I value your time. I don't want to hold you over, but you guys have had some great questions and really helping here. And again, this is going to be the conversation we're having now, really rolling up our sleeves and getting more into this topic of ditch, deal, and delegate is what we're going to be doing next week. And so again, as a reminder, go to the 365 Christ-Centered Leadership Facebook page and select groups. And under groups, you'll see 365 Christ-Centered Leadership Church Consulting Group. Next Monday, August the 23rd from 7 to 8 p.m., we're going to dive even deeper. I'm going to have some polls. We're going to go through some scenarios. We're going to really, really, really be transparent, because here's the thing: we often are we often gravitate toward individuals who in many cases are of like mind, in some cases people who have differences of opinion. But I'll never forget my one of the things that my former mentor, who's gone on to be with the Lord, he died in 2004, Deacon Gene Harris, and he was talking about his role as, at that time, the national church administrator for the denomination that I was affiliated with at the time. And he said, in response to how different dynamics work within groups, within boards, individuals with different personalities, etc., he said this, and it stuck with me: I don't want people on the board who are yes men or yes women. Some people are put off by individuals who are constantly asking questions, seem combative or argumentative. They're really not, but they want to understand. They want to know. There's some people who will embrace something just because and based upon the weight of whoever presented it, based upon their godliness, their Christian living, and I understand that, their reputation. I get that. But he said, I want people on the board who say no, because it will challenge each and every one of us. So that's what we're going to be doing more. So in a little bit more intimate environment in terms of church consulting group, we're going to be rolling up in our sleeves. We're going to have some spirited conversations. But here's the thing: this is all going to be for the glory of God, because again, the mission of 365 Christ-centered leadership is to ignite passion for serving church, for serving Christ, church, and community. And the Bible talks about the importance of iron sharpening iron. That's what we're going to be about. That's what we're going to be doing. And again, I thank each and every one of you for joining us on today. All right. Take care and God bless.